Afternoon to our many participants. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lindsay Gorman. I'm the Emerging Technologies Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, housed at the German Marshall Fund, and I'm so excited to be leading this panel today, this discussion on, I think, a topic that is becoming one of increasing interest across the EU and certainly in the transatlantic space as well, and that is the topic of China's digital Silk Road, in particular, its use of undersea cables and what that means for the EU. We're joined today by some incredible panelists and speakers, really from across the European space for this partnership and this session. Before we launch into it, I want to thank the German Marshall Fund's partners in hosting this project, the Companhia de Sao Paulo, the Luso-American Development Foundation, and the Policy Center for the New South, who have come together to put on this event today. We're joined by, as I mentioned, three panelists, Rebecca Arcesati, an analyst at Merics, Maaike Okano-Heijmans from the Netherlands, and Filipe Batista with the Portuguese digital attaché, the permanent representation at the EU. So I'm really excited to turn it over to our three guests, and we'll go in that order. But as a brief word of scene setting and welcome, we're at a time where tensions are high in terms of China's relationship with Western democracies and democracies around the world. I think that's exemplified in no better way than today's summit and yesterday's summit in Alaska with the United States top officials, and how China exerts its influence on the world stage has new facets that Western democracies and other democracies have not totally been accustomed to. We've traditionally focused on military threats from authoritarian states, but now the new threats are technological. And in particular, China has made this play for the future internet to dominate the industries of the future internet on levels of infrastructure, the applications that go on that infrastructure, and really the governance norms that diffuse through those infrastructure and application layers. We've seen this in the context of the 5G conversation with telecommunications infrastructure, and increasingly with the infrastructure of undersea cables. So I'm delighted to talk about this topic here today with these experts. And I'll start by turning it over to Rebecca Arcesati to give about a 10-minute conversation and talk for each of the panelists, 10 minutes. I invite you to raise questions in the chat after the three panelists have had their chance to give opening remarks. Then we'll turn it over to your questions. So please use the Q&A function, and I'll be collecting those questions and aiming them to the appropriate speaker. Thank you once again for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you, Rebecca, for 10 minutes to explain China's strategy behind the digital Silk Road.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, and thank you to the German Marshall Fund for the kind invite. It's an honor to join this panel today. These are interesting time for Europe's digital connectivity agenda. I think we're finally beginning to see a clearer linkage between digital connectivity and foreign policies. We saw in the Digital Compass, the European Commission mentioned the launch of a digital connectivity fund to support developing and emerging economies that realize the digital transformation. And the Commission mentions the need to realize human-centric digital development. And an unspoken challenge that the Commission is taking on here is clearly China. And indeed, since China has become a leading force in building digital infrastructure worldwide, including fiber optic cables, I think a geopolitical European alternative to China's digital Silk Road in partnership with like-minded countries is definitely a welcome development, and it's something that I've been advocating for quite some time. What is the Digital Silk Road, or DSR for short, but it's not an official acronym, so don't quote me on this. The Digital Silk Road is the technology-focused dimension of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's become a bit of a catch-all term in discussions about the presence of Chinese technology in digital infrastructure worldwide, as well as Chinese commercial engagement with other countries' digital economy. So anything from optical fiber cables and 5G rollouts to what Lindsay mentions as the top layer applications, such as Alibaba's e-commerce platforms and apps, for instance. And I think it's important because this term is being used quite liberally also by the Chinese government to understand what the Digital Silk Road is and what it is not about. And there are 3 points I'd like to make. The first is that not all commercial ventures that Chinese technology companies pursue overseas is the result of a state-led strategy in Beijing. The DSR functions also as an umbrella and a branding tool through which Chinese companies can align their overseas expansion with the state's objectives. And this is very important. Second point is that when it comes to digital infrastructure in particular, drivers related to China's domestic political economy are very, very important to consider. Taking fiber optic cables as an example, China has a massive problem of overcapacity in the sector, which is why the state has been subsidizing the going out of the industry. The sector is also mentioned in the Made in China 2025 industrial policy plan, where China says that it wants to reach 60% of the global market of fiber optic cables. We saw last year the European Commission launched an anti-dumping investigation into optical fiber imports from China precisely because of that, because the sector is heavily subsidized. And so prices are artificially low. Third point I wanted to make is that the internationalization of Chinese information technology and telecommunications companies is not a new development, and it predated the announcement of the DSR in 2015. Chinese policy banks have been providing generous loans and export credits for Chinese companies to build digital infrastructure, but also smart cities across the developing world for almost 2 decades. So that's also very, very important. When it comes to the DSR itself, although the initiative has been less of a coordinated effort than it's often suggested, I think it's clear that the Chinese government has important geopolitical and strategic objectives here. So this is not just about opening markets and about facilitating connectivity. When it was first announced in 2015, the DSR was about promoting the construction of communication trunk networks, including cross-border and undersea optical cables, and build a satellite information passageways centered on China's own dual-use satellite navigation system called Beidou. And the idea to build a China-centric connectivity reflects Beijing's recognition that control over key information corridors and the data traffic that passes through those corridors confers enormous strategic advantages. It also arose from concerns, particularly after the Snowden revelations, that Western dominance over information infrastructure exposed China to cybersecurity risks and threatened China's own national security. But beyond this defensive motive, there's also the fact that the Chinese Communist Party seeks to collect vast amounts of data overseas, which can generate various insights for, among other lines of work, civilian and military intelligence, propaganda, and information operations. The Digital Silk Road also aims to help China achieve dominance in information and communication technologies, as well as in other fields. And we've seen how aggressive the strategy has been for 5G. At the first BRI forum in 2017, President Xi Jinping also spoke of cooperation in the digital economy and innovation-driven development, and he mentioned the need for the BRI to focus on AI, nanotechnology, cloud computing, big data, and other fields. And in 2018, he suggested that the DSR should promote the PRC's leadership in the global digital economy, as well as in international cyberspace governance. So the normative ambition here is very clear, and we see that play out in international organizations such as the International Telecommunications Union. The Chinese government has also identified digital infrastructure gaps across the global south, closing which it presents as China's contribution to development, which is often the case. And building ICT infrastructure also helps integrate Chinese technology into emerging digital ecosystems worldwide. And that helps China increase its influence over technology standards, but also technology governance, the governance of digital and emerging technologies, as well as the governance of cyberspace more broadly. For Europe, I see two main challenges. The one, beyond the issue, of course, of distorted economic competition, which we can maybe touch on in the Q&A. The first is a national security challenge, and that stems from provision in Chinese law, which you will all be familiar with, which basically can pressure Chinese companies to hand over data to the Chinese government. That was the issue with the Chinese providers of 5G equipment, but it's also an issue with fiber optic cables. And the presence of China of Chinese companies in building or owning cables in the Baltic Sea, in the Mediterranean Sea, potentially in the Arctic, is definitely something that should be monitored more closely at EU level, because of the fact that the Chinese military has been working very actively in undersea surveillance and monitoring capabilities, and also it has been leveraging civilian military integration in this field. So the involvement of Chinese companies there, for instance, in the Peace Cable, which is a cable that connects Pakistan to East Africa, South Africa, and then through the Mediterranean into Europe, is something that the EU should be watching much more closely. Second challenge I wanted to mention, and then I'll close, is the issue of norms and values. The provision of digital infrastructure by China also involves the provision of smart city technologies, surveillance technologies, and e-government platforms to countries around the world. And given the fact that China's vision for digital development is one that's centered on state control, censorship, and tight control over civil society, I think it's really important that democracies around the world join forces instead of making disjointed efforts to make sure that there is a viable alternative to the Chinese model that countries around the world can access. And this is, I think, going to be more and more important for the EU to develop that democratic alternative to China's digital Silk Road. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. There was, I think, so much in there that I can't wait to dig into in the Q&A. You know, two particular points that I love that you raised are, one, this nexus between the technology and the norms, I think, is an underappreciated aspect of this competition and of this conversation, that, you know, it's not just about Chinese technology because it's coming from an authoritarian state, but because it can diffuse these authoritarian norms. And then the second point, which is I think really spot on, is that if we care about our values as democracies, we really need to be providing some sort of counteroffer and also clarifying what we mean when we talk about democratic technologies. And I think that's something where there's an immense amount of difference among democracies, you know, the United States, but also I think within the EU itself that I hope we can talk about later on. I'll now turn it over to Maaike Okano-Heijmans. She is a senior research fellow at the Netherlands Institute of International Relations to talk about the current situation in Europe vis-a-vis these threats. So Maaike, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, and to the GMF for hosting this event. It's really very happy with this opportunity to share some of my own findings in this field. And I think there's much that I could have said that would duplicate what Rebecca is saying. So on many fronts, let me start with just saying I agree with her there. I'll repeat some of the points I think that I find most important, and then add also on to what she has said. And three key points that I would like to make is, first of all, that what we should know about the DSR, the Digital Silk Road, is that it essentially combines this domestic push that we know from other sectors to export Chinese technologies that have been developed with assertive industrial policies. And those are combined with an aggressive, broader agenda to increase the interoperability and compatibility of Chinese technologies with those of countries overseas. And this is, of course, creating dependencies also that then also we in turn have to address. So that's because they're not without consequence for us, as they come with standards and norms, Chinese standards and norms that are oftentimes at odds with those of the EU. And perhaps in the, later in my own introduction or in the debate, I think it would be valuable also to discuss what is the, well, where do the EU and the US and the countries that share concerns about China's DSR as such, where do we overlap and where do we diverge? Because obviously we are not all the same. And we have to also take this into account as we take our own initiatives to third countries and as we try to coordinate more in international institutions, because I think it's really those two levels plus this new level sort of international networks and coalitions, ad hoc coalitions that are more issue-based. And that are more flexible, where we also see alternatives being built. And of course, you know, last Friday, the Quad meeting was one example of that. So that would be my first point, having to understand the essence of what DSR does. Then the second is about the EU. Many of you will know that the EU has been developing legislation and new policies in the digital field. And I think if we're talking about China's DSR and Europe's response to it, we have to look at those policies and at the same time look at the many policies that are being devised in the connectivity field and on the Indo-Pacific. And the connectivity in Indo-Pacific sometimes partly overlaps, we can say, but obviously there's also some differences. EU connectivity policies are focused on partnerships, first of all, with Japan. ASEAN came in second. India is now in the making. And of course, there's this Indo-Pacific strategic approach that we can expect to hear more about next month. And all of that together with the digital policies, I think you can think of as Europe's response to China's DSR, or to the situation where security and economy, digital economy, and politics are increasingly more intertwined. Then the third point is that the EU indeed, as Rebecca already said, needs to cooperate with countries that share its concerns. I don't think those are always democratic countries. I also don't think that are even always like-minded countries. So I prefer to talk about countries that share our concerns. And that definitely includes the United States as a very key partner. And of course, with current President Biden, there's many more opportunities than before to cooperate on this agenda. And what we should be doing is to offer value propositions of our own. Real alternatives to DSR offerings, because if in third countries, if the Chinese offer is the one that is on the table that's financially viable, then of course shouldn't be any surprise that countries accept that. But we also know of countries that would definitely also be interested in taking up another proposition if there would be one. So we'll have to work on that. So keywords to me are hard infrastructure. I'm sure that we will hear from Filipe in a minute more about the sea cables. Everybody knows by now about 5G, but there's also the business element to this that sometimes gets less attention, unfortunately, I think, because the role of big tech in all of this is extremely important. The possibilities that fintech offers also. And in e-commerce platforms and innovation, those are also part, I think, of the digital connectivity agenda. And they all build into regulation and governance that was already mentioned. Data are, of course, key to everything. And the European Union set its own standard with GDPR, and I think was slightly surprised by the extraterritorial effects of that. But is definitely now hoping to bank in a similar way on the domestic regulation that can inspire others to do the same and to move towards this more human-centered approach, where transparency is key, where openness is key, where digital inclusiveness is important, and ethical AI as a key word also. Digital ODA, I think, is a final concept that we have to speak about more, because this digital assistance on two third countries that are also wanting to develop, of course, their own e-economies, that need the hard infrastructure to actually build those. We will have to also invest more in that if we are to be serious about what we say in offering our own alternatives. I'd like to zoom out for a second and discuss sort of the contextual points that I think elevate the importance of this digital and geopolitics domain, and at the same time highlight also some of the divergences that we also have to recognize are present. And the first one is digital. That is really at the heart, of course, of this US-China trade tech data conflict. And within this conflict, there's no doubt that the EU is more closely aligned with the United States on many fronts, more closely aligned than with China, but clearly there are also differences. And big tech regulation is, I think, one very clear example of that, so where the EU wants to go much further in regulating big tech. And this is not, I know that many in the United States, they consider this a sort of protectionism, but I think we in Europe have to do much better at explaining that this is really about antitrust. It's about competition, it's about putting consumers first, and it's about protecting our democracies. And I think we only have to refer to what happened on Capitol Hill early January for Americans to realize that this is a serious challenge. And that those are the reasons that the EU is also embarking on this regulation. So there's definitely more close alignment with the United States, but there's also some distance, and no equidistance, as one EU official once put it, no equidistance between the EU and China and the EU and the United States. So we have to, find where we can cooperate. China's moves, I think, as was already said, they do warrant closer scrutiny here, where the US and China, where the EU aligns with the United States on its assessment that China's moves, they evidence very extreme strategic resource allocation by the government, both in the domestic economic sphere as well as in the push to go abroad. And this is obviously undermining the level playing field and thereby European competitiveness of European companies. And also there's these concerns, as already mentioned, about what does this do to standards and to norm setting. So we should be concerned really about the sustainability of European ideas on digital inclusiveness, digital resilience, a data-driven society, individual privacy, free flows of data. If there's more of the digital Silk Road taken to many parts of the world, that will bring, the very welcome development of e-commerce societies and of digital technologies, but it will also come with standards that we don't approve of. So the second contextual factor that I would like to highlight is COVID-19. because that really highlighted, I think, the urgency for all of us to act in this field. I wrote a short piece last year on the COVID-19 as the first digital pandemic. And I think we have to recognize it as such, also because it has amplified some of what China has been doing. It has amplified both the opportunities that China has used in the digital domain to sort of to limit the freedom of speech and thereby allow the virus to spread much more broadly. And it is also today distracting Europe from China's digital push in third countries. So there's these different elements of it. And that's, of course, not even mentioning how COVID-19 also highlighted the potentially devastating consequences of digital connectivity. I think before COVID-19, there was speak about connectivity in terms of, the more the better. And I think we definitely reached the limits of that. And we see therefore now more speak of secure connectivity, of resilient connectivity. And I think that is in itself a good term. So yeah, I could have said more about how DSR started, made in China 2025, and the technological elements of that turned then in 2015 indeed to Digital Silk Road, as Rebecca already said. One thing I would like to add to what she said is that I think now we are sort of at the next phase, where much in the past few years we have heard about the forthcoming very important new communication of the Chinese, which is the China Standards 2035. And that's sort of confirming, I think, to all of us what we have seen happening already. I don't think that the Chinese will make a big splash out of this as they did with the Made in China 2025, which was really over publicized and hence also very much criticized. So we'll have to see what exactly is in there before we actually criticize it all too much. But we have to realize that this is going to be not without consequence. So yeah, let me see what to add to this. Perhaps a few words about the European Commission. I'm sure that most of you will have heard Ursula von der Leyen say last September that Europe must now lead in the digital decade, or it will have to follow the way of others that are setting the standards for us. And following on to that, was of course published this 2030 Digital Compass, the document Europe's Digital Decade. If you haven't seen it yet, I really urge everybody to have a look at it, because this is, I think, also setting the vision, as well as some practical steps towards what the EU will be doing in the coming years. And I think I ran out of time, so I'll leave it to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maaike. So much there. I think the range of topics that you covered really goes to this point that it's not just about what's happening externally, but also kind of what we're doing internally to make these technology systems really work for our values and our concerns. So much I want to pick up on around data, around democracies versus countries that share our concerns, particularly also around sort of how the coronavirus pandemic is shaping some of the geopolitical elements. I'm reminded just this week of what's going on in Brazil with their 5G networks, and how the vaccine diplomacy from China has been particularly effective in creating openings that may not have already existed. So much to pick up on. Thank you so much for such wide-ranging and thoughtful comments. We'll turn it over last, but certainly not least, to Filipe to explain a proposal from the Portuguese presidency on these topics. So Filipe, over to you, and thank you again.
Hi, Lindsay. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'll start to say that my job here is much more easier because the previous speakers, they just addressed a lot of the topics that I was going also to address. So you don't have to listen to me for that long. And I'll start to say that competition is in our European DNA. So make no mistake, we shall compete with China, with US, or any other economic bloc. And for that, the next 10 years will be crucial. And the topic has already been addressed by Maaike. The communication from the Commission on the Digital Decade that was recently presented early this month couldn't be more timely and accurate to that extent. The foundations of the European digital strategy are set. However, what I consider our biggest advantage is also, or can be also, our biggest challenge. And I mean by that, the national and the cultural diversity of Europe. If you think for a minute, China and US, any other country, they take their own decisions based on government and on one government, and also on a single leadership. Europe takes decisions based on consensus, on building that consensus as well, and in worst case scenario by a qualified majority, combining 27 different visions and leaderships. And this is sometimes is not a very easy task. But this was exactly one of the key elements or the starting points for the conception of the European Data Gateway Platform strategy that was actually signed today during the Digital Day, but I'll cover that in a second. And the questions that we made to ourselves initially was, how can we bring 27 member states together and sharing the same vision? On the other hand, how can we ensure a common strategy that can allocate the proper financial resources with 27 different interests? At the same time, how can we better plan a global international strategy, ensuring that all member states, including the landlocked countries that we have, can relate with? The answer at the end came from the core of the European history and what we did better since the Second World War, to build alliances and strong membership focus on common goals. So that was the reason why we came up to the solution, or we present a proposal to the Council that was endorsed at the beginning by 18 member states. And based on that concept that was elaborated in a non-paper, we then drafted and approved and signed today a declaration, a ministerial declaration that gathered not only the 27 member states, but also Iceland and Norway, that put forward a comprehensive strategy that we nominated as the European Data Gateways Platform. And what do you expect, or we expect to achieve with this strategy? First of all, bring together 4 different strategic regions of Europe, promoting and developing, and at the same time contributing to a bigger goal, and seeking a common European instrument. Secondly, a better plan, or to better plan European connectivity between member states, promoting more resilience and redundancy within Europe, so internal connectivity, if you want, and between Europe and the rest of the world, making us, Europe, more autonomous, better connected to other digital markets, which I believe everyone agrees that it's a cornerstone to aim Europe to become the world leader of digital economy, as my previous speaker has already mentioned. I would like now to just share a few slides in order for you to understand more about the rationality of the building of this strategy. Let me start by the beginning, which is where we should start. Okay, so the starting point was taking note of the European conclusions of 2 of October 2020, where, and this has already been taken by the previous speaker, we aim to build our own digital sovereignty, and in order to achieve that, it was clear mentioned that we need to develop and deploy strategic digital capacities, and I would like to underline that, infrastructures. But the question was, what is the state of play of the EU strategic international digital infrastructure? I mean, are we ready for the future? I use these numbers, although I have to say that I'm not truly sure about these numbers, because in my heart, I truly don't believe that anyone can understand and predict the volumes of data that we're going to have in the coming years. I mean, they're roughly estimatives and people bring numbers into the table, but I truly don't believe that anyone really knows what will be the volume, what will be the value of that data economy. And the most important thing that we try to address here was to make sure that whatever will be the volume of data, must be prepared. Europe must be prepared, as I said at the beginning, to compete. And yes, we shall compete. But in order to compete, we need to tackle a very important topic, which was international connectivity. Because if you want to lead digital economy in the world, it's impossible to do that. Mainly focus on the internal market. Yes, the internal market of the European Union is very important. And by that reason, we are now in a new cycle of legislation where we're trying to put forward very important pieces of legislation that will empower and enable the growth of data economy within Europe, the Data Governance Act, the DSA, the DSM. So there's a lot of ongoing work regarding legal frameworks, but we also need to be better connected. And the other point that rises into our minds was to look into the world map of international connectivity, the reality that we have, and we came to a simple conclusion that we are not strategically autonomous. And as you can see from the map, I mean, as number one, we had Brexit. And as you know, and you can see for the map as well, the UK was the major digital hub for international connectivity to come in and out of Europe. And I mean, UK will for sure always remain an important partner and a good neighbor of Europe. But the fact is they are no longer part of the European Union. So this brings an emptiness that we need to address, we need to fill, and we need to understand how can we overcome that. The second thing, and that's what is most tackled in the boxes that you see there, is that the market has changed and radically. The traditional operators on the international connectivity market has been replaced. Now we have the OTTs, or China, as it was presented before, leading that market and making massive investments. And so this is also that we should take into account in order to achieve that autonomy that we are trying also to achieve. So again, we came up with this proposal that was, as I said, endorsed at the council. And just today, I don't know if GMF made it on purpose, but the time was perfect because we had the digital day today, where the 27 member states, as I mentioned before, plus Norway and Iceland, signed the European Data Gateways Ministerial Declaration. And what does this strategy tries to put in place? So dividing Europe in 4 different and big platforms that are totally related with the strategic importance of the same region. So we have the Atlantic one, we have the Mediterranean, we have the North Sea and the Arctic, and we have the Baltic Sea, the Baltic to the Black Sea platform. Dividing Europe to this extent, I believe, and as I said, and now going back to my pretty face, if I may say that, we, as I said, we can better prepare ourselves to the challenge of being better connected and being autonomous. What will be the next steps? And this is important also to make a reference in order to bring more discussion into the debate. So first of all, and this was one of the takeovers from the Ministerial Declaration as well, the Commission will for sure start now to conduct a study to map digital public and private connectivity infrastructures, not only terrestrial, but also submarine and space infrastructures as well. The second point, as I've mentioned before, because no one really knows what will be the volume, is to estimate the incoming and outgoing data flow. Why? Because it's important to know where this data is coming from or where this data is going to, in order to, based on the 4 platforms again, to prepare the better investments and understand where shall we invest first, how, why, and what is the reason for that investment. Then another takeover from the declaration it's to the European Commission to continue to develop the global GENT network, looking for more research, bringing more people working in Europe, although being far away from Europe. And so for this extent, and I'll give you as an example, the BELA program that was a BELA program deployed with Latin America, joining all the universities from Europe and Latin America. This is a very strong tool that will enable the growth of research and academical research in order to empower our communities and then to empower our businesses and the way we live. Actually, during our presidency, this is also a very happy coincidence, we'll have the inauguration of the Link cable that is linking Brazil to Europe, or Latin America to Europe, that will land in Sines, in the south of Portugal, and will be inaugurated at the end of our presidency in June of this year. The fourth critical point that it's also included in the declaration, and I think it will be also a game changer. It's the inclusion of the submarine cables infrastructures as a key part of the critical infrastructures. This will mean that by including submarine cables in critical infrastructures, the whole level of responsibility towards these systems will be leveled up. They will be included in the NIS directive, so including then or improving then cybersecurity, licensing, authorization, and registration of submarine cables, which means that we are now putting international connectivity in the right place where it should belong. Let me just finish by bringing an example that was also already tackled here. It's regarding the sensorization in submarine cables, and give you the example of what we are doing now in Portugal. So this is also one of the reasons we start this whole strategy, because our cables that link Portugal mainland to the islands, Madeira and the Açores, the CAM ring, it's coming into the end of its life, and they should be off by 24, 25. And we realized that this probably could be the same problem that other member states have in their ends. And in fact, it is because several member states realized when we started to discuss this topic that they also have that problem. So we took the opportunity of the renewing of these cables and these links to include, and the study is still ongoing, to include sensorization in the submarine cables. First of all, because it will prevent early awareness, or we create earlier awareness for natural disasters like submarine earthquakes that then will become tsunamis. So this will enable authorities to create awareness in the mainland, so that people could be safe and goods could be safe as well. But also it's a very powerful tool for detecting underwater movement. So I mean, and this falls into the importance of bringing submarine cables into critical infrastructures. So to conclude, I mean, I think we've done an important, or we have taken important decisions in the last months within the European Union. We're very proud, of course, as the Portuguese presidency, to be able to contribute to this overall goal, which is the empowerment of Europe and helping Europe to become leader in the digital economy, like the President of the Commission has expressed really clearly. And for that extent, I mean, this could not be more timely. All this conjunction of factors that, hopefully the pinpoint of all this journey will be the inauguration of the Link cable in June this year, that we desire and hope that will not be the last one. More cables are to come, and in that extent, I hope that we are now in the right track to achieve the common goal, which is to be autonomous and to become leaders of the digital economy. I'll stop here, and of course I'll be available for any questions or any doubts that you may want to address. Thank you very much once again, Lindsay. Back to you.
Thank you so much. So some great new information there, and excited to hear about that cable and some really fascinating developments. We have great questions in the chat. I was thinking that I would maybe need to start off asking some questions, but I think I will go right to the questions from our audience, and in particular pick up on one involving the consensus process that some of you alluded to. And I think, Filipe, you mentioned this point about how China can act more quickly because it's a one-party state. It doesn't have to deal with the messiness of democracy, and certainly not the messiness that takes place in an organization like the EU. And so it can move much faster. So I'd like to sort of take that question that originally came from Garrett, saying that European decision-making processes are by definition rather slow, and how can Europe really compete with China on that time scale and raise and really sort of light a fire under policymakers on this issue, and also kind of compare that to the context of the recent EU digital decade that I think Maaike mentioned. Now, a number of analysts actually criticized this EU digital decade proposal, feeling that it wasn't ambitious enough. For example, the EU digital decade tries to have 5G everywhere in the EU by 2030. Many are saying that goal is actually not quite ambitious at all. In fact, 2025 is when we're going to have a third of the world being completely connected on 5G, and by 2030 perhaps we'll be in the realm of 6G. So I'm curious to maybe the three panelists, maybe starting with Maaike and Rebecca, even whether you agree with that assessment that these are not ambitious enough goals, and or in fact are they? And then how can kind of the relative slothfulness of European or multilateral decision making compete with an authoritarian state that's driving hard on particular technological objectives? So maybe, Maaike, we can start with you.
Sure, happy to take on that question. That's a really good one, that point that Gerrit raises. Yes, of course, European decision making is by definition slow. At the same time, I think we have to also appreciate that in the past few years, the EU policies on China have moved at an unprecedented speed. And I'm not sure if that's just, an amazing speed for, considering the fact that Europe is generally, slow, because this is a collection of 27, unfortunately, by now member states. But it's really telling, I think, of the importance that all EU member states attach to the topic. So that's the first point I would like to make. Yes, overall, processes tend to be slow, but we've moved rather quickly on China policies. If you look at what the 5G toolbox, the speed at which this came out, that's one example. Investment screening is another example. And this Europe's digital decade, I think, was also, after, put on the agenda by Ursula von der Leyen, and she now comes up with a report that, yes, you can always say we should be even more ambitious. But I have to say also to that, I've seen too many EU reports that have been all too ambitious and were not realistic. So I actually tend to appreciate the sense of realism that also speaks out of this. Where I would like to see more ambition is the funds, because it's really the funds that can, that we need to act. And that's where I've not been seeing much ambition in the multilateral financial framework. For example, look at the neighborhood, what's NDICI, this new tool, which is mostly focused on Africa for good reasons, because that's our neighborhood. But I would like to see more funds also going, for example, to the Indo-Pacific. That's ground zero for where China's DSR is at. And we should not just leave that to our partners in the Pacific, who are doing a lot already themselves, and also act on that. So the funds, I think, is where I would like to see more. At the same time, I think we need to recognize that it is also in the EU happening is sort of coalitions of first movers. It's the France and Germany that have come up with a initiative for cloud computing, and a European cloud computing network, Gaia-X. And in other fields on export controls, my own country has been also on the forefront of discussions with third countries and some EU countries to push these agendas forward. So the EU is, of course, a collection of member states, and it's great if they all can move together. But I think many are recognizing now also the importance of the topics and moving ahead also in smaller settings. And I think it's a great sign that this does not also always, go at the expense of, EU unity on the matter. So yes, I feel your frustration sometimes. I share that, but I see also quite a few positive signs. I'll leave it to that.
Thank you. Yeah, not sure, Rebecca, if you'd like to weigh in on that and perhaps also address a question that was aimed directly at you on the idea of whether Barcelona could provide a positive model for a democratic smart city.
Thank you. No, I fully agree with Maaike. I'm glad that she brought up the many successes of European China policy over the past few years. In particular, the 5G toolbox. I think it's something that we shouldn't forget also, because that's providing a model already for other countries who want to think more seriously about the cybersecurity of 5G networks. So I think that's a big success. When it comes to bureaucratic infighting and the slowness in the EU, I would say that was a big problem unfortunately, with the connectivity strategy. The Europe-Asia connectivity strategy, unfortunately, moved a bit slowly because of that issue. And it wasn't very clear how many funds would materialize for that strategy. But I think now with the digital compass, again, I mentioned that there's this idea of setting up a digital connectivity fund. I think we're seeing much more movement. I think we're seeing this clear linkage between digital connectivity and foreign policies, which I find very promising. Again, big focus on Africa. A digital development hub was launched with the African Union, for example, at the end of last year. It makes a lot of sense because Africa is a strategically important region for Europe. Massive growth in bandwidth demand, growing now, and it will be growing even more over the next few years. So it's crucial for Europe to be a leading player in Africa, I think. But as Maaike mentioned, it's also important to look at the Indo-Pacific, and I'm really curious to see what synergies there can be between EU initiatives and potentially the Quad in the region, and whether we'll be able to, I think an important point is linking our efforts, now these jointed efforts on digital connectivity. We have the US Blue Dot network, we have Japan's initiatives, we have strong cooperation between the EU and Japan already, as Maaike mentioned, but not so much between the EU and the US. And I think we should really, I hope we will see more of that in coming years. On the other question, so I forget now, what was the second question, Lindsay?
Barcelona as a model for a democratic smart city.
Definitely. I mean, I think the fact that we're seeing Chinese providers playing a pretty important role in a number of smart city projects on EU soil is something that should be tackled. I mean, we see a big a presence of Huawei, for example, as a player in the digitalization of public administrations around Europe. A company that's also implicated in mass human rights violations in China, in Xinjiang in particular. So when we see that, I think it's, on EU soil, I think it's really important that we provide our own alternatives that are based on EU values and EU norms. It's not just about providing those alternatives to other countries, but also, in EU member states. And I think there's a lot to be done to tackle the presence of high-risk vendors, not just in the 5G network, but also, projects like smart cities where a lot of personal and government data, sensitive government data is involved.
Thanks so much. I think that brings us sort of right into a next question in the chat. And I see Filipe would like to say something. If I could maybe ask this question and to actually turn it over to you, because we're quickly running short on time. So feel free to tackle the last question as well as this one, which is whether you see the EU concern over commercial or security interests here. This kind of weird interplay in the technology sphere, I think, has caused that question to rise to the surface. And in the particular context of Chinese-owned cables, if the assumption is that they're insecure, how long will it take to move away from that dependency? So that question, and also your thoughts in response to the previous one.
Yeah, I was really triggered by the previous one, and I wanted to comment on that. Basically, because I saw from Jean-François, I think a question here. It sounds like Europeans have to choose between Xi Jinping and Mark Zuckerberg, or let's say the GAFAs. Isn't it a very tough choice indeed? Well, in any day, I'll choose Europe for sure, and that's what we're trying to do here. And that's why we're trying to pull all these strategies together in order to have our own way, because it's true the decision process might be long, difficult, tough, and believe me, being in the presidency of the council really made me see that very clearly. But at the end of the day, I believe that we still are able to deliver better solutions. And the fact is that for sure, and that's the reason why also we need, and we put forward this international connectivity strategy, is because people believe and feel safe within the European Union model and within the European way of doing things. More human-centric, giving all the protection to your privacy. And I kind of disagree when people look into our regulatory models and to what we're trying to build here and say that we're being protectionists. No, it's a different way. It's building shields in order to protect the Europeans and protect our data, and not necessarily building walls. That's I think that's totally the opposite side. So when you say that we need to better combine a lot of instruments, well, that's true, and I believe I totally agree with Maaike. We do have to put in place different instruments, different wheels, and as I said, I mean, it's 27 member states and 27 leaderships trying to implement the same goals, and sometimes this is difficult to achieve. But again, we have to find that way out, because, for instance, at AI, if we look into the budget of the European Union for AI, and we see roughly approximately 8 billion euros, and then we look into the budget of Facebook and Google together in terms of AI, you see 30 billion. There is a huge gap here, and we have to find ways to overcome that gap. But I mean, with the different initiatives, and Rebecca, she mentioned one very important, which is the D4D hub. I mean, a different approach to the way we do development, the way we cooperate with other continents. I mean, totally different from the policy that the United States have, or even more different from the policy towards development that China has. I mean, we are building that in a different way, in a more human-centric way, in a more European way, which at the end of the day, I have to underline this, I believe it's the more correct one. But at the same time, in order to enable all this and to become a leader in the world digital economy, we must be connected. And again, the last point I would like to raise, and I'll stop here because I know time is running short. For instance, in terms of infrastructures, we are working together, for instance, with the US on the Open RAN approach in order to deploy 5G infrastructures. So it's an innovative way, it's an alternative way. And don't forget, I mean, we still have powerful companies that deploy infrastructure, digital infrastructures in Europe, and we should embrace them. We should help them, obviously, in a very transparent and competitive way, and not doing with what other countries do, which is pretty much directly support private sector. That we don't do. Back to you, Lindsay.
Thanks. I'd love to ask a question from Maya Nuance from the chat. I think is really interesting. She asks, what are the author's assessment of pushback to Chinese digital investments in Europe and the neighborhood region, not just the rhetorical part, but the actual pushback? She identifies sort of the business element here that's important in offering alternatives. Chinese companies have won some contracts because Western ICT companies deem large ICT infrastructure projects too risky from a business perspective. Have you seen any evidence that Chinese tech infrastructure projects have changed the risk calculus of Western companies when considering investments in some of these new markets? And to what extent do you think that the strategy of restricting the export of high-tech advanced components to China will actually slow down or change the trajectory of the digital Silk Road? So really interesting questions in there. So whoever wants to jump in, feel free.
I'll give a quick answer because that's not my field of expertise. I'll just say that I don't totally agree with the expression of pushback. What I think that Europe is doing, and it's totally within its power and totally free to do it, is to make sure that we have a safe environment, and that our citizens and our users can freely and in a very relaxed way still use and benefit from technology without being afraid of losing their privacy or losing identities or be in some sort of risk. So there are still good examples of good cooperation between European companies and Chinese companies, at the same time with US companies. So it's very easy to let go those buzzwords, but we need to look into more detail of what's really going on. And of course, there is a turn down in terms of 5G because it's simple. There was a regulation that created a connectivity toolbox, security toolbox, 5G security toolbox. And if you don't comply with the measures and the guidelines that are within the toolbox, I mean, you cannot be part of the system. It's simple as that. It's pure democratic and totally open and totally transparent. So, I mean, there are good examples on one side, but there are also good examples on the other side.
Can I add to that?
Please.
Yes, indeed, great questions. And I think it links also to that other question that came in just before Maaike's about the procurement processes in Europe. And as I read those questions, I had to think about the not digital, but the infrastructural project of that bridge in Croatia. It's a Pelješac bridge, if I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but there was this bridge, and it was in the end the procurement was awarded to a Chinese company because they had the most financially attractive offer, basically. And I spoke to Croatian officials shortly afterwards, and they were not happy with the results. But they said, and not just because it was a Chinese company, but because they thought we should go for quality infrastructure, not just for the best financial offer. But the procurement rules that were present then sort of forced that choice for the most financially attractive offer on those on the government. So following EU procurement rules, they couldn't not go with the Chinese offer. And I think that was a lesson. I have to admit, I'd be really curious to know, where procurement rules have changed. I have not really, don't have the latest on that, but I know that this was an incentive to look into this again. And I'm hoping that also as we prepare the new digital regulation in Europe for big tech and platforms, that we also incorporate this sort of element, because now sometimes I have the impression that what we are doing in Europe is regulating because of the sort of the issues that we see with the currently present big tech companies. And as we all know, those are mostly American. I can order also in the Netherlands from Alibaba, just as I can order from Amazon, but beyond sort of the package delivery, it's really a lot of it's the US tech companies that are present here. So we are regulating, and I think we have to have the conversation in Europe whether we are also regulating for that next challenge where other companies, big tech companies from China that raise bigger concerns, for example, on data, whether we are also already regulating for that purpose. So that's sort of how the two connect in my mind, the procurement issue where we did not sort of design procurement rules with an eye to unlevel playing field offerings, if you will, coming from China. And now we should be regulating also for the long term on big tech. So that's one. Have I seen evidence that Chinese tech infrastructure projects may have changed the risk calculus? No. And I may not be aware of, I'm definitely not aware of everything. So there could be some. But I know here the Japanese have tried to incentivize their own companies, right? Even to work with Chinese companies in third markets. Also, well, in an attempt to sort of reshape Chinese companies and to better understand what they are doing, why they are doing this. But this real calculus in the end was what made it so difficult for them to really cooperate in practice. So that was sort of unsuccessful. And I know of, even the people that I speak to here in Europe that sort of are open to the idea of incentivizing companies to go to markets. They have not found solutions. So no, I haven't seen that suggestions of that. Rebecca, I'm sure you want to add also.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Maaike covered already a lot of ground. I'm grateful you brought up the issue of public procurement, and this allows me to sort of also address Maya's question, or part of it, which is the issue of our toolbox in Europe. Is it enough to compete with China to address both the national security, the economic security, and the human rights risks there? I think there's still a lot of work to be done. Public procurement is one example where I think, for example, human rights considerations should be given much more space. I mentioned the issue of Chinese smart city offers in Europe. We also have companies like Hikvision or Dahua that have high market shares in the European surveillance hardware market, for example. Those providers are compromised companies that have a big role in and complicity in human rights violations in China. So what are we going to do to make sure that we don't, especially our public administrations, don't procure technologies from those providers? That's still an open question. On the pushback on Chinese tech investments in Europe, again, I think we've seen a lot of progress, but still we need to make sure that we achieve greater harmonization between FDI screening regimes. A lot of member states still don't have an investment screening regime in place. And that obviously leaves us vulnerable to unwanted technology transfers to China. And another aspect of the toolbox is the export controls regime, of course. I think we saw a big victory with member states agreeing on a framework to regulate the export of surveillance technologies to authoritarian regimes. We need to see how that will be implemented going forward, because national authorities will have ultimately the last say when it comes to giving licenses to companies or not.
We are tight on time. We have just about 5 minutes left, so I may take two of the questions. Unfortunately, we can't get to them all. One that seems an interesting topic, given the emphasis on climate change and also green technologies, is China's digital agenda also linked to China's energy agenda? China is a leader in long-distance HVDC energy grids. Is there a connection here? And then additionally, feel free to jump in on the question of the European Data Gateway strategy. Does that allow for decisions to be taken more quickly and providing a new standard to move more quickly? And then I guess thirdly, how does the pandemic and the economic uncertainty and the rebuilding that's necessary in the pandemic context feed into Europe's future competitiveness? And do we need an economic reorientation? So any and all of those three questions I think are great. And maybe we'll have sort of one last quick go for each panelist, maybe starting with Filipe.
Thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, on the relation between the energy and digital, really, I'm not an expert on that on the Chinese side, but I would say probably yes, because we are doing the same thing. I mean, there is a strong relation between the green initiatives and the digital initiatives, and the digital green is a buzzword that everyone is using. So I'll assume that they're using that. Regarding the data gateways question, and there's also another good question there that Elisa is asking, because she doesn't get why do we need more connectivity. Well, first of all, as I said, I mean, in Europe, we don't know what is the state of play at this moment. Like the example I gave from Portugal, that the submarine cable systems that linking Portugal to the islands are coming into an end. This is the same case in other member states. Plus, the more important one is the fact that we don't know if we are ready for the volume of data that we're going to have in the coming years. So we have to prepare for that. Finally, because the submarine cables that we have are old, they are not new submarine cables, so they do not adapt to the exponential volumes of data that we are having, and for sure going to have more. Finally, the decision-making process, that was initially one of the first arguments that I put forward regarding the division of Europe in 4 different platforms. This will enable us to make smarter decisions, faster decisions, especially in terms of the investments that will be needed, because if we can understand the flows of data and match that with the investments that we need, because for sure, again, I underline, we're going to need more investments in international connectivity. For sure, that process will be much faster, because then you can tackle the problems that you have on the Mediterranean, on the Arctic and North Sea, which is a very important part of the strategy, but also in the Atlantic and in the Baltic to Black Sea. So dividing the map of Europe in these 4 different platforms will for sure be easier to make the decision and to finance the projects that were made or that were presented based on the decisions divided in the 4 different perspectives that also encompasses the different geopolitical difficulties that we face in the different 4 platforms. And I'll stop here to leave others also to comment. Sorry.
Thanks. Rebecca, maybe some last comments from you on those questions or anything you'd like to address.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe I'll address the question about ultra high voltage development in China just very briefly. And I recommend a report that a couple of colleagues at Merics published recently on green digitalization or digital green development in China. Those 2 agendas in China are closely related as they are in the European Union. China is also doubling down on efforts to make its economy greener. We see that in the 14th 5-year plan, and there's a big emphasis on the linkage between green and digital. They have been investing massively in ultra high voltage networks, also as part of a new infrastructure push that we saw last year at the 2 sessions. Problem there is that the grid system needs to be reformed in China quite entirely, basically, to make sure that the new technologies can be actually used by the system. So there's a lot of progress that needs to be made to make sure that that technology can actually be used by grid providers in China. And I'm not sure they are there yet.
Maaike, some last comments from you.
Yes, well, I'd like to engage with a question that was raised also about big tech regulation quite early on. And the US being skeptical of EU regulation, yes, but at the same time, there are, of course, developments in the US that I've also noticed towards this end, towards more regulation of big tech. And I've seen also several appointments in the Biden administration of people that are, well, have have shown that they would be willing to push for that agenda. So that's definitely a good sign. I was also hoping and thinking that this is a chance for engagement, but I guess my hopes were a little bit put down when, as I spoke to some US friends in the United States. So I think it's still, the jury is still out there, and I think the EU has really to invest in explaining why we are doing this. This is not to crush competition, but this is trying to help our consumers, put our consumers first, and it's an antitrust issue, and also to protect our democracies. And again, I think if we frame it as such, then the chances for cooperation with the United States on this issue are much bigger. And we need that because we need to take this agenda also to third countries, as I said earlier. Perhaps a final word, if I can. No, I wish I could just, think of a way to create new money. Of course, I cannot. So that is really a key issue, and I'm grateful for for the person that raised this issue. That our governments have to really be so much more prepared to invest and invest and invest, and not just in as I labeled it, digital ODA, so going to third countries, but also in innovation. Because we cannot keep China small. China is always going to develop. We have to try to stay ahead, and we have to develop a better story that will also convince others that our proposition, ultimately for the greater number of people, will be more attractive. And that requires huge investments that I think we just have to ensure that will be there. Yeah. I'll have to leave it to that.
So many challenging questions, so much intersection. Thank you, the three of you, so much for your time. This was a fascinating conversation. I learned something. I hope our audience did too. And thank you to the audience for some really wonderful questions. I only wish we'd had time to go through each and every one of them, but I think the speakers did a fantastic job of picking some interesting ones. And thanks again to GMF and our partners for putting on this event. And enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend. And thank you for tuning in.
Thank you so much.